In this video, we'll be looking at some of the general facts about the United States and the Confederate States of America. And these are the basic facts that will determine the course of the war. So we'll be looking at stuff like leadership and population and war goals. So understanding these general facts about these two areas will help us to understand how the rest of the Civil War plays out. Here are the goals for this video. Let's begin by looking at the reasons why each side said they were fighting this war. And so this is interesting because, as we know, the root cause of the war was conflict over slavery. Abraham Lincoln had promised during his campaign that he was going to halt the spread of slavery, and he had said occasionally beforehand that he viewed slavery as an evil that should eventually be eliminated. And the South seceded primarily because of Lincoln's claims about slavery. But neither side wanted to claim that slavery was the main reason they were fighting. So they had other reasons to explain why they were fighting this war. So the South claimed that they weren't fighting to protect slavery, but rather that they were defending their constitutional rights. They claimed that they were defending their right to own property, aka to own slaves, and they also claimed that they had the right to leave the United States. They claimed that in the beginning of the country, when the Constitution was written, every state agreed to join of its own free will, and that every state should also have the right to leave the United States whenever it cared to. And of course they cared to leave now because Abraham Lincoln had said he wanted to limit slavery. And then there's the North. So the North basically claimed that they weren't fighting to stop slavery, but rather they were fighting to uphold the Constitution. And Abraham Lincoln said over and over again that his main reason for fighting the war was to prevent the southern states from seceding because he believed that it was unconstitutional for a state to leave the country, that it wasn't allowed. And here's one famous sentence in which he claims or explains what he is doing. He says, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union." And so why did Lincoln all of a sudden change course and start talking more about the Union than talking about limiting slavery? The main reason for this, guys, is because Lincoln wanted to keep the border states on the side of the North. So if you look at that map there, you see those grayish, light blue states, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. So those were areas of the United States that had slavery, but that decided to stay with the North. Lincoln, in the opening stages of the war, didn't want to say anything bad about slavery because he wanted to keep these states in the Union. And so instead of saying that he was fighting against slavery, he said that he was fighting to uphold the Constitution. And by not talking about slavery, he was able to keep at least a few slave states on the side of the North. And this was a big deal for later on in the war. So in the North, the political leader and commander-in-chief was Abraham Lincoln, who was now president after the election of 1860. And he was more or less unexperienced in military matters. He had never really been a soldier or anything like that. But he had a lot of qualities that made him a good commander-in-chief. He was flexible, he was patient, and he was willing to learn from his mistakes. And he became a better and better decision maker as the war went on. In the South, there was President Jefferson Davis. And this guy was an experienced military leader. He had fought in the Mexican-American War, he had gone to West Point Military Academy, so he knew how wars worked. But he also had a couple of negative traits that cost him over the course of the war. He was proud, he was short-tempered, and he would hold grudges. So sometimes he would not promote generals or would not give orders just because he didn't like a particular person. And this ended up costing him sometimes later in the war. On the military side of things, the South had the definite advantage in terms of leadership. The North had a lot of very weak generals. A lot of the North's generals at the beginning of the war had been promoted to the rank of general for political reasons rather than reasons of actual military skill. So there were a lot of guys who were good at schmoozing and making friends, but weren't very good at actually commanding troops. They did have a few good generals, but these guys tended to be lower ranking, and they weren't in charge of very much at the start of the war. Most famously, Ulysses S. Grant was a low-ranking commander out west, and it wasn't until the end of the war that he was given total command of Union forces. The South, on the other hand, had excellent generals from the start of the war. General Robert E. Lee is considered by many to be one of the greatest military tacticians of all time, and he shows his skill again and again by defeating larger Union armies. And his second in command, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, became famous throughout the war as a master of deception and mobility, and was basically able to run circles around Union armies for the first couple years of the war. But so how was the war going to end? What did each side have to do to actually win the war? Well, the North had a lot to do. It had to fight an offensive war. If it wanted to win, what it had to do was to actually go down into the South to destroy its armies and to capture its major cities. And this was not an easy task. The Confederacy, as you can see there, the red states, was a huge territory. And so the North was going to have to do a whole lot of work if it wanted to actually conquer this vast territory. And it's going to take the North 5 years to actually accomplish this goal. Well, 4 years more. But, you know, a long time. The South, on the other hand, was fighting a defensive war. All it had to do was fight the North to a standstill. If they could just continually tie the North, eventually they thought the North would give up and then the South would win its independence. So it seemed, at least at the beginning, that the South had an easier goal to achieve, while the North had a whole lot of stuff that it had to accomplish if it wanted to be victorious. So in this regard, the South had the advantage. But now let's look at some other things that are relevant when two countries are at war. We're going to look at stuff like population, industry, transport, and naval power. So in every category, except for the category of military leadership, the North had a huge advantage over the South. So as we mentioned already, in terms of military leadership, that is generals, the South had the advantage. The North had mostly bad generals, whereas the South had a couple, at least, top-class generals commanding its armies. In terms of population, the North had a big advantage over the South. There were 22 million people in the United States, that is, in the Union. And in the South, in the Confederacy, there were only 9 million people. And about like 3.5 to 4 million of these people were enslaved African Americans. And these guys weren't even allowed to fight. So the actual fighting force of the South was very small. In terms of industry, the North had a huge advantage. The North had the majority of, not even the majority, the vast majority of the nation's factories, ironworks, everything. So if you needed something made, you could make it in the North. In the South, there was not very much industry at all because the South had always depended on trading with other countries to get what it needed. And so the South is in a big disadvantage when it comes to actually making stuff like clothes and shoes and guns. Transportation, the North also has a big advantage. Most of the country's railroads are in the North, And railroads are going to be super important for moving around supplies and armies and cannons. And so the North has another big advantage there, whereas the South, once again, doesn't really have very much going on in the way of railroads. And the few railroads it does have are going to get torn up over the course of the war. And that means its armies are going to have to walk everywhere they go, and it's going to be hard to get food and ammunition to the armies in the field. And last of all, the North has a huge advantage in naval power. Most of the country's ships sail out of the big northern port cities of New York and Boston, and the other northern cities as well. And that's where most of the country's naval strength is. The South really doesn't have very much in the way of navy strength. And this is bad because if you have a really powerful navy, you can surround the enemy's coast and block them from trading. And that's exactly what the North does. They set up a blockade, prevent the South from trading with anybody, and this gives the North a huge advantage over the South. So basically in every category, the North is winning. So now let's summarize. So the North had a really difficult war goal of having to actually invade the South. And at the beginning, it had weak military leadership. But it had huge material advantages over the South. More people, more factories, more trains, more guns, more ships. The South, on the other hand, had a relatively simple war goal of just protecting its territory until the North got tired and decided to quit. And it also had strong military leadership to command its armies. But it had fewer people, fewer factories, fewer trains, fewer guns than the North. And eventually, as the war dragged on, these disadvantages would start to catch up with the South. But so now I want you to think, based on all the info that you have, which side had the advantage at the beginning of the war? And did it seem like it was going to be close, or that one side was going to be able to crush the other? All right, that is it. Here are your goals one last time. Thanks for watching.